Hello Board Game Workshop, my name's Adam Singer and I'm the designer of Voracious, a speak and write game that plays 2 to 6 players, takes about 25 minutes to play, and is recommended for ages 10 and up. So Voracious was formerly known as Terraform on Mars in the Board Game Workshop competition, but based on feedback and playtesting I decided to change the theme entirely to make this more accessible for my target audience, and to avoid confusion with a certain other game that shares a similar name. I'm going to start with a quick overview of the game, and then we'll jump into setup and a quick rules explanation. It's the heart of the summer, and the toil and effort of the local gardeners is beginning to show promise. It'd be a shame for all that hard work to go to waste, so it's up to you and the local critters to show your appreciation. In Voracious, players are controlling different garden pests, trying to devour as much of the garden as possible. Each player is going to have 2 areas of their own to devour: the garden and the greenhouse. In order for players to devour their garden, they're going to have to taste the areas that they intend to eat. The garden and the greenhouse are both represented by their own special grid. In order for players to devour their garden, they must first taste the areas that they intend to eat. This is done by marking a single line across a space in the garden grid. And Voracious innovates on the board game genres that you're familiar with because it's actually a variant on a roll and write that I like to call a speak and write. And the reason I call it that is because there's no dice at all. On a player's turn, they're going to pick 2 spaces on their garden grid to taste. One of those is going to be selected in private that only the active player gets to taste, but then one is going to be announced publicly that all players have to taste. So you can see how players' decisions are going to affect every other player in the game. Some spaces on the garden grid will have different icons, and these icons are activated immediately as soon as that space is tasted. But of course, you're not going to want to stop at just tasting a space. You're going to want to call in your swarm and devour all the spaces you've tasted all at once. Swarms are represented by shape cards, and to call in a swarm, you're going to have to taste enough spaces so that together they form the shape on the shape card in your hand. When that happens, those spaces may be devoured by marking those spaces with another line to form an X. Devoured spaces can never be used again to form another shape, but the shape that you did complete grants you some bonuses and victory points. But the destruction doesn't stop there, because you'll also be using your caterpillar to devour the greenhouse. Just like players all have their own garden grid, players all have their own greenhouse grid as well. And in the greenhouse is a soul caterpillar that's trying to move through and grant you bonuses throughout the game. The caterpillar moves through the greenhouse only by eating adjacent spaces, but the caterpillar's movements are connected to the activity in the garden. So every time you taste a space in the garden, the caterpillar has to move to an adjacent space that matches the color of the space that you tasted in the garden. So if you tasted a green space in the garden, your caterpillar has to move to an adjacent green space. And if you taste a beige space in the garden, then the caterpillar has to move to an adjacent beige space. The caterpillar's starting position will be marked with an X, but every movement from there will be marked with an arrow so that you know exactly the direction that the caterpillar came from. This is important so you remember exactly where your caterpillar is, because the caterpillar can never cross its own trail. Because of the speak and write nature of this game and the way that all your grids work together, you're going to find yourself in the position to taste spaces that don't benefit you. In this case, there's one more option for you, and that's to use a redirect card. You can discard any redirect cards you have in order to shift the location that you're required to taste. This is going to be super important as you play the game, because it's going to allow you to be more efficient with your movements and maybe even win the game. Oh yeah, and be careful, because the gardener will periodically check in on the garden and pull out any plants that you've tasted before you have a chance to devour them. So to set up the game, each player is going to start with a garden sheet and a pencil. The shape cards are going to be divided into 2 decks. One deck is going to contain all the shapes of 4 blocks and less, and the other deck is going to contain all the shapes of 5 or 6 blocks. Shuffle both these decks and put them within reach of all the players. Also shuffle the redirect cards and put those face down within reach of all the players. Next, reveal 2 cards from each shape deck, totaling in 4 shapes, and all players are going to mark those shapes anywhere they want in their garden, putting an X in each space that they use. Any icons that get covered at this portion of the game do not get activated, and players are not allowed to cover any pepper icons at this time. Shapes can always be rotated, but they can never be flipped or mirrored. Next, all the players are going to draw those same 4 shapes in the greenhouse, following the same set of rules, with an additional rule that none of those shapes can be touching each other in any way. Discard all those shape cards once all the players have completed drawing the shapes. All players then draw 1 shape card from either of the 2 shape decks, and the difference between these decks is one has smaller, easier shapes, and one has larger, more difficult shapes. All players also draw 1 redirect card each from the redirect deck. Players can gain different combinations of these cards throughout the game, but they may only ever hold 5 cards total in their hand. Next, reveal 2 more shape cards from each shape deck and just leave those face up beside their associated decks. This creates a display where the active player can purchase more shape cards throughout the game. Next, players can choose a starting location for their caterpillar in the greenhouse, and they can just pick any location they want and mark that with an X. If you covered any icon, make sure to gain the benefits of that icon. After that, each player gets to taste 1 space in their garden for free and mark that with a single line. And if you cover any icons, those icons get activated as well. So that means you now have to move your caterpillar to an adjacent space in the greenhouse that matches the same color of the space you just tasted in the garden. Mark this movement as an arrow from your starting space. If the new space has any icons, then those get activated immediately. And that's it for setup, so whoever last stepped in a garden gets to go first and is now the active player. The active player gets to pick 1 space to taste privately that only they get to taste, and then 1 space to taste publicly that all players must taste. This can be done in any order, and that's important because your caterpillar is going to move anytime you taste a space. So pay attention to which colors you're tasting and make sure to taste those in the order that benefits you. Another bonus of being the active player is that you get special buying rights when it comes to shape cards. Normally when buying a shape card, players can only draw blindly from one of the 2 shape decks of their choice. However, when you're the active player, you have the added option to choose something from the display. When purchasing a card from the display, you immediately replace that with another card from the associated deck. When the active player has completed their turn, the next player clockwise becomes the active player. I mentioned a few actions you can do as the active player, however there's also a lot of actions you can do when you're not the active player, and these are called anytime actions. These actions include completing a shape card. Shape cards are your primary method of getting victory points, and when you complete them, you get the victory points specified on the card along with any other bonuses. To complete a shape card, you must have it in your hand, and you must have tasted enough spaces in your garden grid to match the shape on the card. Remember that shape cards can be rotated to complete them, but they can never be flipped or mirrored. Mark any spaces used with an X to indicate that those spaces have been used to complete a shape. Those spaces are now devoured and can never be used throughout the rest of the game. There's going to be times where people are going to be announcing spaces for you to fill that you're not going to want to fill. This is when it becomes handy to use a redirect card to fill in a different space instead. And the next action you can perform anytime is using a redirect card. Redirect cards can only be used to redirect to other untasted spaces. If a space is already tasted, or if the redirect card takes you off the board, then you can't use it. Redirect cards have a circle in the middle which represents the space that you're required to fill, and then the redirect card will also have 4 dots surrounding the circle, which represent alternative spaces that you can fill in instead. So if a redirect card has a red dot 2 spaces to the right of the center of the redirect card, then that means that you can alternatively fill in a space 2 spaces to the right of the space that you're required to fill. And the final action you can perform at any time is to buy something from the shop. Currency in this game is represented by leaves that you'll be collecting throughout the game, and 2 leaves will buy you a redirect card, 3 leaves will buy you a shape card, and 5 leaves will allow you to taste any untasted space on your garden grid. One thing to note when buying a shape card is that you can only buy from the revealed shape cards if you're the active player. If not, then you have to draw blindly from one of the shape decks. When it comes to filling in spaces on your garden grid, if a space has already been tasted and you're required to taste it again, then you do nothing and you miss out on that opportunity unless you use a redirect card to redirect that to an untasted space. If your caterpillar is ever required to move to a colored space that it's not adjacent to, then your caterpillar does nothing and that opportunity is lost. I mentioned before that there's a lot of different icons across the garden grid and the greenhouse grid, so let's get into what exactly each of those icons do. If you ever mark a space with a leaf icon on your garden grid or your greenhouse grid, you immediately gain a leaf, and you can track this by circling a leaf on your leaf tracker. These are used to make purchases throughout the game, and if you ever use a leaf, just cross a line through it to indicate that it's been spent. If you ever mark a space with a purple pointed flower icon in the garden grid or the greenhouse grid, then you immediately get to mark in an adjacent space on the grid for free. Remember when filling in spaces on the garden grid that your caterpillar is going to move for each one. If you ever fill in a space that has a pepper icon on it, then that's bad for you because all other players get to move their caterpillar up to 3 spaces of their choice, and each crossed out pepper counts as -1 point for you at the end of the game. There's one icon that appears in the garden that doesn't appear in the greenhouse, and this is the dove icon. If you ever fill in this space, then you get to pick up your caterpillar and drop it in another space up to 6 spaces away. This means that you don't draw a line between these 2 points, and instead you mark an X to mark where your caterpillar was picked up, and another X to mark where it was dropped. If used cleverly, you can use this ability to jump over spaces that your caterpillar has previously visited. There are also a few icons in the greenhouse grid that don't appear in the garden grid, and the first one is the blue flower, and when the caterpillar enters that space, you get to gain 1 victory point on your victory track. The next icon is the shape icon, and when a caterpillar enters that space, the player gets to gain a shape card for free. And then finally there's the target icon, and when the caterpillar moves into that space, the player gets a redirect card for free. You'll also find some of these icons on the point tracker, and when you reach that score, you'll get to gain those items for free. And now that you know how to play the game, I got one more surprise for you, and that's the pesky gardener. Mixed in with the shape cards are gardener cards, and anytime a gardener gets drawn into the display, that gardener is going to try and stop you from devouring some of the spaces that you may have tasted. The gardener only ever allows 3 single tasted spaces that are not adjacent to another tasted space. So if the gardener ever shows up, you have to cross out all the extra spaces you have so that you're back down to 3. This is why it's so important to try and complete shapes quickly and to try and taste spaces adjacent to each other. All gardener cards are ignored if they're drawn blindly from the deck. So if you need a shape card but you're worried about the gardener, feel free to draw a shape card from the deck as normal. And that's everything you need to know about playing Voracious. Once you get comfortable with it, you can throw in the extra module for secret objectives. When playing with this module, each player starts the game with 3 secret shapes of their own. These shapes grant victory points at the end of the game if you can fit them into empty spaces on your garden grid. Each objective can only be used once, and you cannot use the same space to fulfill multiple objectives. No matter how you play, endgame scoring is the same, and that's to first start with your score on the point track. Players can then spend any leaves they have left and try to complete any additional shapes, adding those points to their score. If you're playing with the secret objectives module, tally those points and add them to your score. Finally, count up any peppers that may have been crossed out on your garden sheet and subtract those values from your score. If there's a tie, the player with the least empty spaces on their garden wins the game. If there's still a tie, the player with the most leaves left wins the game. And if there's still a tie, you both win. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll leave some print and play file links in the description below if you want to check out the game for yourself. Until next time, keep that shelf cluttered and the table full.